He humiliated his pregnant wife in front of everyone. Unaware her Korean Mafia ex-husband was already on his way. The crystal glass tilted slowly above Becky Maynard's head. She didn't move, couldn't move. The champagne cascaded down her face, soaking through her carefully styled hair, dripping onto the silk of her red maternity gown. Her hand instinctively went to her swollen belly, protective, trembling. Dennis Copeland stood beside her, his arm draped casually around the blonde woman in white who'd just emptied the glass. He was smiling, that same charming smile he wore in boardrooms and charity galas. The smile that had convinced Becky he was different, safe, normal. The woman in white, his mistress, laughed. A sharp, performative sound that echoed through the marble-floored ballroom. And the crowd? They did nothing. 200 of the city's most powerful people. CEOs, politicians, old money and new influence. They stood there with champagne flutes and smartphones raised, recording every second of Becky's destruction. Some whispered, a few smiled. Most just watched with the cold curiosity of people who'd never known consequence. Becky's throat tightened. Her eyes burned, not from the champagne, but from the weight of their stares. She'd left everything behind for this life, for safety, for respectability, for a man who promised her a world without violence. And now she stood alone, 6 months pregnant, drenched in humiliation while her husband publicly claimed another woman. What Dennis didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Becky Maynard hadn't always been Becky Maynard. Years ago, she'd been someone else, married to someone else. A man she'd fled in the middle of the night because she couldn't bear the darkness that followed him. A man who never begged her to stay, never chased her, never even called. He'd simply disappeared. And in his absence, Ji-hoon Solomon had become something far more dangerous than the man she'd left behind. Outside the ballroom, a black sedan pulled silently to the curb. The door opened. Expensive Italian shoes touched the pavement. A man in a dark gray suit stepped out, his expression unreadable, a hint of ink visible at his collar. Behind him, 3 more men emerged. Silent, synchronized, lethal. Inside, Dennis was still smiling. He had no idea that in less than 60 seconds, everything he believed about power, control, and consequence was about to shatter. Because the wrong man's wife had just been touched. And Ji-hoon Solomon never forgave that. The champagne continued to drip from Becky's chin, falling in slow, deliberate drops onto the polished marble floor. Each one landed with a sound she felt more than heard. A tiny, humiliating percussion that marked the seconds of her degradation. Her fingers pressed against her belly, feeling the baby move inside her, oblivious to the cruelty unfolding around them both. She wanted to run. God, how she wanted to run. But her legs wouldn't cooperate, rooted to the spot by a paralysis born of shock and something deeper. The terrible, dawning realization that this wasn't an accident or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was deliberate, planned. Dennis had orchestrated this. The blonde woman, Clarissa Vance, daughter of a hedge fund titan and everything Becky apparently wasn't, stepped back to admire her work. She handed the empty glass to a passing waiter with the casual dismissal of someone who'd never been denied anything in her life. Her sequined white gown caught the light from the crystal chandeliers above, making her look almost angelic. The irony wasn't lost on Becky. Clarissa's red lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the suddenly quiet ballroom with perfect, practiced projection. "Oops," Clarissa said, her tone dripping with false innocence. "How clumsy of me. But then again, pregnant women do tend to make everything so awkward, don't they? Taking up so much space, making every room feel just a little too crowded." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not loud, raucous laughter. That would have been too honest, too human. This was polite amusement, the kind that slithered between expensive suits and designer gowns, the kind that allowed everyone present to participate in the cruelty while maintaining plausible deniability. Becky's eyes darted across the sea of faces. She recognized so many of them. Margaret Chin, who'd complimented her dress at last month's gala. Thomas Rivera, who'd told her she was glowing just an hour ago. Sarah and David Morrison, who'd sent a gift when they'd learned about the pregnancy. None of them moved. None of them spoke up. Their phones remained raised, cameras recording, capturing every angle of her humiliation for whatever purpose amused them. Social currency. gossip, entertainment. It didn't matter. What mattered was that in this moment, surrounded by hundreds of people, Becky had never felt more alone. Dennis's hand found the small of Clarissa's back, a possessive gesture he'd once reserved for Becky. He pulled his mistress closer, and the message was unmistakable. This wasn't a betrayal he was trying to hide. This was a public declaration, a changing of the guard. Becky watched his face, searching for some remnant of the man who'd proposed to her 2 years ago on a beach in Santorini, who'd promised her safety and stability and a life far removed from the chaos she'd left behind. But that man, if he'd ever truly existed, was gone. In his place stood someone she barely recognized. "Becky, darling," Dennis said, his voice smooth and controlled, the same tone he used during business negotiations. "You're making a scene. Perhaps you should go freshen up? You look unwell." The audacity of it stole her breath. She was making a scene. Not Clarissa, who'd just assaulted her. Not Dennis, who'd brought his mistress to what was supposed to be a celebration of his company's latest acquisition. Her. The victim was being framed as the problem, and the worst part was how easily everyone accepted that narrative. Heads nodded in agreement. She could hear the whispers starting already, could imagine tomorrow's headlines and social media posts. Poor Dennis Copeland, stuck with an emotional, unstable wife. No wonder he sought comfort elsewhere. Becky's hand trembled as she wiped champagne from her eyes. The liquid stung, or maybe that was just her tears mixing with it. She couldn't tell anymore. Her red maternity gown, chosen so carefully that morning because Dennis had mentioned he loved her in red, now clung to her skin in dark, wet patches. She felt exposed, ridiculous, exactly as they'd intended. A phone flashed nearby, someone capturing a close-up of her face. She turned toward the source and found Jessica Lang, a society columnist who'd interviewed Becky 6 months ago for a puff piece about successful couples. Jessica didn't lower her phone, didn't stop recording. She just smiled apologetically, as if to say, "It's nothing personal, darling, just business. That was the elite for you. Everything was business. Every interaction was transactional. Every relationship could be monetized or weaponized depending on which served them better in the moment." Becky had known this, of course. She'd observed it from the periphery during her 2 years as Dennis's wife. But she'd foolishly believed that being married to one of them offered some protection, some immunity from their casual cruelty. She'd been wrong. Dennis leaned down and whispered something in Clarissa's ear. The blonde woman giggled, actually giggled, and kissed his cheek, leaving a lipstick mark that he made no effort to wipe away. The crowd seemed to collectively exhale, the tension breaking as conversations resumed. The show was over. Becky was dismissed, already forgotten as waiters circulated with fresh champagne, and someone turned the music back up. A jazz quartet in the corner began playing something upbeat and mindless, the perfect soundtrack to pretend nothing had happened. Becky finally found the strength to move. Her legs felt like lead, each step requiring conscious effort, but she managed to turn toward the exit. The crowd parted for her, but not out of courtesy. They simply didn't want to be associated with her humiliation, didn't want any photographic evidence that they'd been standing too close when she'd been destroyed. She kept her head up, her hand protective over her belly, her spine straight despite everything screaming at her to collapse. She passed a mirror and caught her reflection. Mascara streaked down her cheeks. Her carefully arranged hair hung in wet, limp strands. The red dress that had made her feel beautiful that morning now made her look like a wounded animal. She looked away quickly, unable to bear the sight. Behind her, Dennis's laughter echoed through the ballroom, deep and confident and completely unburdened by guilt. He'd won. He'd publicly humiliated her, claimed another woman, and faced absolutely zero consequences. In fact, judging by the approving nods and congratulatory handshakes he was receiving, his social capital had somehow increased. That was the game. The powerful could do whatever they wanted to whomever they wanted, and the world would reshape itself to justify their actions. Becky pushed through the ornate double doors into the lobby, finally escaping the ballroom's suffocating atmosphere. The sudden quiet felt almost violent after the noise and chaos. Her heels clicked against the marble as she made her way toward the exit, past floral arrangements that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, past staff members who averted their eyes with the practiced skill of people trained to see nothing. She'd almost reached the main entrance when she felt it. A shift in the air. A change in pressure. Like a storm rolling in, invisible but undeniable. The concierge's phone rang. He answered it, listened for a moment. Then his expression changed. Fear. Actual, genuine fear on the face of a man who dealt with billionaires and celebrities daily. Behind her, she heard the ballroom doors open. Voices spilled out, then abruptly cut off. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the polite quiet of people choosing not to speak. This was the stunned silence of people who'd forgotten how to breathe. Becky turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs for reasons she didn't yet understand. Through the lobby's glass doors, she saw a black sedan idling at the curb. The kind of vehicle that cost more than most houses but somehow managed to look understated, unremarkable, forgettable. Except it wasn't. There was something about it that commanded attention, that whispered of danger and consequence. The rear door opened. A man stepped out, his movements economical and precise. Dark gray suit, perfectly tailored. Black shirt underneath, no tie. The cut of the fabric couldn't quite hide the ink that crept up from his collar, couldn't quite soften the hard angles of his face. He looked at the building, then at the entrance, then, for just a fraction of a second, his eyes found hers through the glass. Becky's world tilted. Her knees buckled, and she grabbed the nearest column for support. Couldn't be. It wasn't possible. She'd left that life behind 5 years ago, had buried that part of herself so deep, she'd almost convinced herself it had never existed. She changed her name, moved across the country, built an entirely new identity. She'd been so careful, so thorough, but Jihoon Solomon had found her anyway, and judging by the 3 men emerging from the sedan behind him, each one radiating the kind of controlled violence that made security guards step back instead of forward, he hadn't come alone. The column felt cold against Becky's palm, the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly turned liquid and unstable. She couldn't look away from him, couldn't force her eyes to break contact even though every survival instinct screamed at her to run. Jihoon stood perfectly still on the sidewalk, his expression unreadable in the way she remembered too well. That carefully controlled blankness that revealed nothing and promised everything. 5 years hadn't softened him. If anything, the edges had sharpened. The danger that had always simmered beneath his surface now radiating outward like heat from asphalt in summer. She'd been 23 when they met. Young enough to mistake intensity for passion, dangerous for exciting. He'd walked into the restaurant where she waitressed, and something about the way he moved, purposeful, aware, lethal, had made her drop an entire tray of glasses. He'd helped her clean up the mess, his hands careful and steady, and when he'd asked for her number, she'd given it without hesitation. The first red flag she'd ignored in a series of red flags that would define the next 2 years of her life. Jihoon had never lied to her about what he was. That was the thing people didn't understand when she tried to explain it later, in therapy sessions she could barely afford. He'd told her on their 3rd date, matter of fact and unflinching, that his business involved things she was better off not knowing about. He'd given her an out right then, told her she could walk away and he'd never contact her again. But she'd been stupid and young and convinced that love could exist separate from circumstance, that she could have him without having his world. They'd married 6 months later in a small ceremony that her parents refused to attend. She'd worn a simple white dress from a department store, and he'd worn a black suit that probably cost more than her yearly salary. His associates had filled the room. Men in expensive clothes with expensive watches and eyes that tracked every movement, every exit. She'd felt like a bird in a cage made of diamonds, beautiful and trapped and slowly suffocating. The violence had never been directed at her. That was what made it so insidious, so easy to rationalize. Jihoon treated her with a gentleness that bordered on reverence, as if she were something precious and breakable that needed protection from the world. But she'd seen what happened to people who crossed him, had witnessed the cold efficiency with which problems were eliminated. She'd learned to read the signs, the late-night phone calls, the sudden disappearances, the way tension would coil in his shoulders before someone inevitably ended up in a hospital or worse. She'd lasted 2 years before the weight of it broke her. Not the luxury or the protection or even the isolation from her old life. It was the knowledge, the terrible burden of knowing what he was capable of and being powerless to stop it. She'd wake up at night imagining scenarios where his world crashed into hers. where someone used her to hurt him, where she became collateral damage in wars she didn't understand. The fear had eaten her alive from the inside out until there was nothing left but the desperate need to escape. So she'd run. Planned it for 3 months, carefully and methodically, the way he'd taught her to approach problems. She'd taken nothing but clothes and her grandmother's necklace, had withdrawn small amounts of cash over time so nothing would trigger suspicion. She'd left in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon while he was at a meeting, had taken 3 buses to a train station 2 towns over, then a train to a city where she knew no one and no one knew her. She'd expected him to follow. Expected phone calls and messages and men showing up at whatever cheap motel she'd hidden herself in. Expected the full weight of his resources and connections to come crashing down until he found her and dragged her back. But none of that happened. Her phone stayed silent. No one came looking. It was as if she'd never existed to him at all. And somehow that had hurt worse than any pursuit could have. She'd rebuilt herself slowly, painfully, changed her name legally, enrolled in community college using her new identity, got a job at a marketing firm. She'd dated casually, keeping everyone at arm's length, convinced she'd never trust anyone enough to let them close again. And then she'd met Dennis Copeland at a company networking event, and he'd seemed like everything Ji-hoon wasn't. Stable, respectable, safe. He worked in finance, wore expensive suits without looking dangerous in them, talked about quarterly projections and golf handicaps. His world was predictable, boring, normal, exactly what she thought she needed. The courtship had been textbook. Expensive dinners at restaurants where everyone knew his name, weekend trips to his family's vacation homes, introduction to his circle of influential friends who smiled with too many teeth and spoke in coded language about deals and acquisitions. She'd mistaken his attention for affection, his possessiveness for love. He'd seemed so different from Ji-hoon that she'd failed to recognize the similarities until it was too late. The control had crept in gradually. First it was suggestions about her wardrobe. Wouldn't she look more professional in something more conservative? Then comments about her friends. Did she really need to spend so much time with people who weren't going anywhere in life? Then management of her schedule, her finances, her choices. Always framed as concern, as wanting what was best for her, as helping her reach her full potential. By the time she'd realized she'd traded one cage for another, she was already pregnant and married and drowning in a life that looked perfect from the outside while rotting from within. Dennis had never hit her, never raised his voice above a certain controlled volume. But he'd perfected the art of emotional dissection, knew exactly where to cut to cause maximum damage while leaving no visible scars. He'd isolated her systematically from everyone who might have noticed, might have questioned, might have helped. And tonight's humiliation wasn't an aberration. It was the culmination of 2 years of death by 1,000 cuts, the final public demonstration that she was nothing and he was everything and the world would always take his side. She'd chosen Dennis because he wasn't Ji-hoon, because he represented safety and normalcy and all the things she'd convinced herself she wanted. But standing in this lobby, watching her past and present collide, Becky finally understood the difference between a man who controlled through fear and a man who controlled through cruelty. Ji-hoon had been dangerous, but he'd never made her feel small. Dennis had never raised a hand to her, but he'd spent 2 years systematically destroying who she was. Through the glass, Ji-hoon began walking toward the entrance. His 3 associates flanked him in a formation that was clearly practiced, clearly purposeful. The doorman reached for the handle, then seemed to think better of it, stepping aside as if some primal instinct warned him not to impede their path. Becky's breathing came in short, sharp gasps. Her baby kicked, sensing her distress, and she pressed her hand to her belly in automatic comfort. Whatever was about to happen, whatever Ji-hoon's presence meant, one thing had become crystalline clear in this moment of reckoning. She'd spent 5 years running from the wrong man. The glass doors swept open with a whisper of hydraulics, and the temperature in the lobby seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ji-hoon crossed the threshold first, his footsteps silent despite the marble floor, moving with the kind of economy that suggested every action had been calculated and stripped of unnecessary motion. His associates followed in perfect synchronization, 3 men who looked like they'd been carved from the same stone, their faces blank, their eyes constantly scanning, cataloging exits and threats and vulnerabilities with the automated precision of machines built for a single purpose. The concierge's hand hovered over his phone, frozen mid-dial. His throat worked as he swallowed, and Becky watched him make the decision in real time. Whatever number he'd been about to call, whatever security protocol he'd been trained to follow, none of it would matter. Some threats couldn't be stopped by procedures and policies. Some dangers operated on a frequency that bypassed normal channels of authority entirely. He lowered the phone slowly, carefully, as if afraid any sudden movement might draw attention. Ji-hoon's eyes swept the lobby, taking in the marble columns, the fresh flower arrangements, the gold-accented fixtures that screamed old money trying to look older. His gaze passed over Becky without pause, without recognition, as if she were just another piece of expensive decoration. The lack of acknowledgement hurt more than she'd expected. A sharp reminder that whatever they'd been to each other had ended the moment she'd walked out. But there was something in the set of his shoulders, the angle of his approach, that told her he knew exactly where she was. He'd always known where she was. Behind them, through the still open doors, Becky caught a glimpse of the street. 2 more sedans had pulled up, blocking traffic. Men in dark suits stood beside them, not making a show of their presence but not hiding it either. A police car approached, lights off, then seemed to think better of whatever intervention it had planned and turned down a side street. The message was clear. This situation had already been handled at levels far above street patrol. In the ballroom, the music had stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence, replaced by the kind of silence that only comes when a room full of people collectively holds its breath. Becky heard the click of heels as someone, probably Clarissa, shifted position, followed by Dennis's low voice asking a question she couldn't make out. No one answered him. The power dynamics that had governed the room 30 seconds ago had evaporated, replaced by something more primal. Fear had a smell, Becky remembered, metallic and sharp, like blood or copper or lightning about to strike. Ji-hoon reached the ballroom doors and paused. One of his associates, a man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, moved forward and pushed both doors open simultaneously. The Baroque handles swung inward with theatrical slowness, revealing the frozen tableau inside. 200 of the city's elite stood scattered across the marble floor like chess pieces mid-game, their champagne flutes suspended, their smartphones lowered, their carefully cultivated masks of superiority cracking to reveal something raw underneath. Ji-hoon entered, and the room seemed to contract around him. Not because of his physical size, he wasn't particularly tall or broad, but because of the way space itself reorganized in his presence. He became the center of gravity, the point around which everything else orbited. His associates fanned out behind him, taking positions that Becky recognized from a lifetime ago. Exits covered. Sight lines maintained. Threats assessed and prioritized. The guests nearest the door stumbled backward, their expensive shoes tangling with each other in their haste to create distance. A champagne flute slipped from someone's hand and shattered on the marble, the sound absurdly loud in the stretched silence. No one moved to clean it up. The waitstaff had melted into the walls, becoming invisible through sheer will and survival instinct. Dennis stood frozen near the center of the room, Clarissa still tucked against his side, though her earlier confidence had evaporated. His face had gone through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, irritation, then slowly dawning unease as he registered what everyone else already understood. This wasn't a guest who'd wandered in from another event. This wasn't a drunk party crasher or a delivery gone wrong. This was something else entirely, something his money and connections and carefully cultivated relationships couldn't shield him from. Becky watched him try to assert dominance anyway, because that was what men like Dennis did. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his bow tie, and took a step forward as if approaching a business negotiation rather than his own reckoning. His voice came out steady, controlled, the same tone he'd used when firing employees or denying her request for grocery money despite the 6 figures sitting in their joint account. "I don't know who you think you are," Dennis said, his words carrying across the silent ballroom. "But this is a private event. You need to leave before I have security escort you out." The threat landed like a stone in deep water, sinking without ripple or effect. Ji-hoon didn't respond, didn't even look at Dennis directly. His gaze continued its sweep of the room, cataloging faces, making mental notes of who was present and where they stood in whatever hierarchy governed his world. Becky recognized several people visibly trying to shrink, to become smaller, to avoid that casual assessment. She saw Richard Thornton, A real estate developer who'd sat beside her at last month's charity auction actually takes several steps backward until he bumped into a column. She saw Miranda Zhang, tech CEO and self-proclaimed disruptor, suddenly find her phone fascinating, her fingers trembling as she typed nothing. Dennis's face reddened, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Clarissa had detached herself from his side, her survival instincts apparently sharper than his ego. She'd backed toward a cluster of older women who'd formed an unspoken protective circle, as if age and money could serve as armor against whatever was unfolding. "Did you hear me?" Dennis's voice rose slightly, a hairline fracture in his control. "I said, he heard you." One of Ji-hoon's associates spoke for the first time, his accent placing him somewhere in Seoul's business districts. His tone was flat, informative rather than threatening. "Everyone heard you. It changes nothing." Dennis opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Becky watched him search the room for allies, for the security team that should have responded minutes ago, for the influential friends who'd been clapping him on the back and recording his wife's humiliation. No one met his eyes. The security guards who usually stood at discrete intervals along the walls had vanished. His friends had developed sudden interest in the floor, the ceiling, the abstract art hanging in gilded frames. Ji-hoon finally moved, taking 3 steps forward that brought him into the light of the central chandelier. The illumination caught the ink at his collar, revealing the edge of a design that Becky knew continued across his shoulders and down his back. A dragon, rendered in traditional style by a master artist in Busan. She'd traced those lines once, had fallen asleep with her head against those scales. The memory hit her like a physical blow. "Where is she?" Ji-hoon's voice was quiet, almost conversational. He wasn't asking Dennis. He was asking the room, and somehow that was worse. The question hung in the air like smoke, spreading and suffocating. Dennis's confusion was genuine. "Where is who? What are you?" "The woman who was humiliated here tonight." Ji-hoon's tone didn't change, didn't rise or sharpen. It remained perfectly level, perfectly calm. The pregnant woman who had champagne poured on her head while 200 people watched and did nothing. That woman. Where is she? The words landed like grenades in silk wrapping. Becky's breath caught. He hadn't come for business or territory or whatever wars men like him usually fought. He'd come for her. Dennis's face cycled through emotions too quickly to catalog. Confusion giving way to recognition, recognition blooming into fear, fear hardening into defensive aggression. He glanced toward where Becky had exited, then back to Ji-hoon, and something in his expression shifted as the pieces began assembling themselves into a picture he didn't want to see. His hand went to his pocket, reaching for his phone, the lifeline he'd always relied on to solve problems that money and influence could fix. Before he could pull it out, one of Ji-hoon's associates moved with startling speed, crossing the distance between them and placing a hand on Dennis's wrist. Not violently, not even forcefully, just enough pressure to suggest that reaching for that phone would be a mistake Dennis wouldn't get to regret. "You don't need to make any calls," the man said softly. "The people you'd call are already aware of the situation. They've chosen not to intervene." Dennis jerked his arm away, but the phone stayed in his pocket. "You can't just walk in here and threaten me. Do you have any idea who I am? Who these people are?" He gestured broadly at the room, at the assembled wealth and power that had always been his shield. "One call and I'll have 50 lawyers. Thomas Brennan withdrew his firm from your retainer an hour ago." Ji-hoon's voice cut through Dennis's bluster like a surgical blade, precise and merciless. "Citing conflicts of interest. You'll find the termination letter in your email." Gerald Schwartz at Pinnacle Legal followed 20 minutes later, as did Jessica Moreno at Whitfield and Associates. The color drained from Dennis's face. Those weren't just lawyers. They were his lawyers, the legal architecture that protected his business dealings and personal interests. Becky watched him process this information, watched him try to find the angle, the explanation that didn't lead to the conclusion currently forming. "Your primary accounts at Sentinel Private Banking were frozen at 6:47 this evening," Ji-hoon continued, his tone never changing, never rising. He could have been reading stock quotes or discussing the weather. "Pending investigation into irregular transactions flagged by federal regulators." The secondary accounts at Harbor Wealth Management followed at 7:15. Your line of credit was suspended. Your investment portfolio is under audit. The IRS received an anonymous tip regarding offshore holdings approximately 3 hours ago. They found it credible enough to act immediately. Dennis's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Someone in the crowd, Richard Thornton, maybe, or one of the other men who'd been laughing 30 minutes ago, made a soft sound of distress. The implications were spreading like blood in water. If Dennis could fall this quickly, this completely, then none of them were safe. Their money, their power, their carefully constructed empires could be dismantled in an evening by someone who understood how to pull the right threads. That's impossible, Dennis finally managed, though his voice had lost its authority. Those accounts have protocols, safeguards. You can't just. Your business partner, Marcus Webb, sold his 43% stake in Copeland Industries to a shell corporation based in Singapore at 5:30 this afternoon. Ji-hoon tilted his head slightly, a gesture Becky remembered from their marriage. He did it when he was explaining something to someone who should already understand. The corporation is owned by another corporation which is owned by a trust, which is controlled by people you've never met and never will. Marcus is currently on a plane to New Zealand with his family. He won't be returning your calls. Dennis swayed slightly, as if the floor had become unstable beneath him. Marcus wouldn't. We've been partners for 15 years. Marcus was shown evidence of your creative accounting practices. The money you've been siphoning from the employee pension fund. The bribes paid to secure the Henderson contract. The insider trading that netted you $7 million last quarter. Each revelation landed with surgical precision. He was given a choice: cooperate and walk away clean, or face federal prosecution alongside you. He chose survival. Most people do. The room had gone so quiet Becky could hear her own heartbeat. She'd moved closer without realizing it, drawn toward the destruction of the man who'd spent 2 years systematically destroying her. She should feel something, she thought. Satisfaction, vindication, relief. But all she felt was a hollow sort of numbness, like watching a building collapse in slow motion. Clarissa had detached herself completely now, backing away from Dennis as if his downfall might be contagious. Her face was pale under her makeup, her earlier cruelty replaced by naked self-preservation. Several other guests had begun edging toward the exits, subtle movements they probably thought were discreet. Ji-hoon's associates tracked each departure with their eyes, but made no move to stop anyone. This performance wasn't for them. The board of Copeland Industries held an emergency meeting 20 minutes ago, Ji-hoon said. You've been removed as CEO, effective immediately. They cited erratic behavior and pending legal issues. Your severance package has been revoked due to the morality clause you signed 3 years ago. The one about bringing the company into disrepute. Your reputation is the disrepute, in case that needed clarification. Dennis lunged forward, all pretense of control abandoned. You can't do this. This is my company. I built it from nothing. Everything I have, everything you have was built on lies, intimidation, and the exploitation of people weaker than you. Ji-hoon's voice finally changed, dropping to something colder, harder. You thought power meant being able to humiliate a pregnant woman in a room full of witnesses. You thought it meant no one would stop you because no one ever has. You were wrong. He took a single step closer to Dennis, and the movement carried more threat than a raised fist. Real power is quiet. It doesn't need audiences or approval. It doesn't require anyone to watch or record or validate it. Real power is the ability to dismantle someone's entire existence, while they're too busy performing for a crowd to notice the ground disappearing beneath their feet. Dennis's legs gave out. He didn't fall dramatically but rather folded, his knees buckling until he was half sitting on the edge of a nearby chair. His hands shook as he pressed them to his face. What do you want? Money? I can get you money. Just tell me what you want. I don't want anything from you. Ji-hoon's dismissal was absolute. You have nothing I need. Nothing I couldn't take if I wanted. You're not a negotiation or a business transaction. You're a consequence. He turned away from Dennis as if the man had ceased to exist, his attention shifting to scan the room once more. His gaze found Margaret Chen, the woman who'd complimented Becky's dress while filming her humiliation. You should delete that video, he said quietly. All of you should. The footage from tonight has a way of disappearing. Phones malfunction. Cloud storage corrupts. Hard drives fail. It would be unfortunate if your device was the exception. The sound of people frantically tapping their phones filled the ballroom. Becky watched 200 powerful individuals scramble to erase evidence like schoolchildren caught cheating. No one questioned the instruction. No one protested or cited their rights. They simply complied, because the alternative had been demonstrated with surgical clarity through Dennis's destruction. Ji-hoon's eyes finally, deliberately, found Becky's across the distance between the ballroom and lobby. The contact lasted less than a second, but in that fraction of time she saw everything she'd run from 5 years ago. The danger, yes. The violence, absolutely. But also the protection, the fierce and uncompromising loyalty. The quality she'd mistaken for control when really it had been devotion expressed in the only language he knew. He looked away first, releasing her from the weight of his attention. "We're done here," he said to his associates. They moved immediately, forming up around him in their practiced configuration. He walked toward the exit, toward where Becky still stood frozen by the column, and she pressed herself back instinctively. He passed within 3 feet of her, close enough that she could smell his cologne. Cedar and smoke unchanged after all these years. He didn't stop, didn't slow, didn't acknowledge her existence beyond that single glance. The doors closed behind them with a soft click, and the spell broke. Someone sobbed. Another person vomited into a potted plant. Dennis remained slumped in his chair, his empire ash, his future evaporated. The reckoning had lasted less than 10 minutes. That was all the time it took to unmake a man who'd believed himself untouchable. Becky stood in the lobby watching the sedans pull away, their taillights disappearing into the city night like embers fading. Her hand remained pressed against her belly, feeling the baby's movements. Each kick a reminder that whatever just happened wasn't about her alone anymore. She was responsible for another life, a tiny person who would ask questions someday about how they came into the world and what kind of people their parents were. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing and clarifying all at once. Behind her, the ballroom had erupted into controlled chaos. Voices overlapped in urgent whispers. Phones rang with calls from lawyers and publicists and damage control specialists. She heard Dennis's voice rising above the others, desperate and pleading, trying to reach someone who might still take his call. No one was listening. The crowd that had recorded her humiliation with such enthusiasm was now focused entirely on their own survival, calculating how much distance they needed to put between themselves and the wreckage of Dennis Copeland. Becky's phone vibrated in her small clutch purse. She pulled it out with trembling fingers, half expecting to see Ji-hoon's name on the screen after 5 years of silence. But it wasn't him. It was a text from an unknown number, a local area code she didn't recognize. The message was brief, almost clinical in its precision. Keys to apartment 4B, 1247, Riverside Drive, are with the concierge. 6 months paid in advance. Furnished. Safe. Medical coverage arranged at St. Catherine's under Dr. Sarah Chun, OB specialist. File for divorce Monday. Lawyer's contact information in envelope at apartment. You will not be bothered again. No signature. No name. No request for gratitude or acknowledgement. Just facts, resources, a path forward laid out with the same surgical efficiency he'd used to dismantle Dennis. Becky stared at the message until her vision blurred, reading it 3 times to make sure she understood what was happening. He'd planned this. Not just tonight's intervention, but everything after. He'd created an exit strategy for her that required nothing from her except the courage to take it. A second text arrived seconds later, this one even shorter. The baby. Is it safe? Her throat tightened. Of course that would be his only question. Not about her, not about them, not about the 5 years that had passed or the life she'd built without him. Just the child, the innocent party in this mess, the one person who deserved protection above all else. She typed back with shaking fingers. Yes, we're both safe. The response came immediately. Good. Nothing else followed. Becky waited, her phone screen glowing in the dim lobby light. But the conversation was apparently over. That was Ji-hoon's way, she remembered. Say what needed saying, do what needed doing, then walk away without demanding recognition or gratitude. She'd mistaken that quality for coldness once, for emotional unavailability. Now she understood it was something else entirely. Respect. He respected her enough not to trap her with obligation or guilt, respected her choices even when they'd led her away from him. The concierge cleared his throat softly, and Becky looked up to find him holding out a small envelope with her name written on it in precise handwriting. "This was left for you, Mrs. Copeland, or—" He hesitated, uncertain what name to use now that her marriage had imploded so spectacularly. "Miss Maynard." She took the envelope, noting how the concierge avoided meeting her eyes. Word had already spread through the staff about what transpired upstairs, about the pregnant woman who'd been humiliated and the dangerous man who'd arrived to tear her husband's world apart. By tomorrow it would be all over social media, the society columns, the whisper networks that governed elite circles. But the story would be different from the one Dennis had tried to write. Instead of a pathetic, unstable wife making a scene, she'd be the woman powerful enough to summon a kingpin, mysterious enough to have hidden a past that could destroy empires. The envelope contained 3 items. A key card for the apartment building Ji-hoon had mentioned, a business card for an attorney named Rebecca Choi who apparently specialized in high-conflict divorces, and a handwritten note on heavy cardstock. The note was brief, just like his texts, but the handwriting made her chest ache with recognition. She'd seen that writing on birthday cards, on notes left on the kitchen counter, on the single letter he'd written when they were fighting about whether she should go back to school. "You chose safety over happiness once. Now you know the difference. Choose better this time. For the baby. For yourself. You were always stronger than you believed." No signature on this either, but she didn't need one. Becky folded the note carefully and placed it back in the envelope, then turned to face the concierge. "Could you call me a car? Not from the building service. An independent one." He nodded quickly, grateful to have a concrete task. While he made the call, Becky walked to one of the lobby's leather couches and sat down carefully, arranging her champagne-stained dress around her swollen belly. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished marble floor. A woman who looked nothing like the person she'd been 3 hours ago. That version of herself had believed she needed to be smaller, quieter, more accommodating to deserve safety. Had accepted humiliation as the price of stability. Had convinced herself that love and cruelty could coexist as long as the cruelty stayed verbal. Through the ballroom doors, she could see Dennis pacing, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing frantically at people who'd stopped listening. Clarissa had disappeared entirely, probably already crafting her narrative about being an innocent party manipulated by a powerful man. The guests were filtering out through side exits, avoiding the main lobby where Becky sat, as if her presence might contaminate them further. Margaret Chun walked past, her eyes downcast, and Becky felt a flicker of anger cut through her numbness. This woman had complimented her dress while filming her destruction, had participated in the cruelty with the casual enthusiasm of someone who'd never faced consequences. "Margaret," Becky called out, her voice steadier than she expected. The woman froze, her face cycling through fear and calculation before settling on an expression of false sympathy. "Becky, I'm so sorry about what happened. If I'd known." "You did know," Becky interrupted quietly. "You stood there and watched. You filmed it. You could have said something, done something, been anything other than complicit. But you chose to be part of it because it was easier than standing up for someone with no power." Margaret's mouth opened and closed, her practiced social grace failing her. "I didn't mean, it wasn't personal." "That's worse," Becky said. "That you'd participate in destroying someone and have it mean nothing to you. That it was just entertainment, just content, just another story to share at brunch. You should think about that. About what it says about who you are." She didn't wait for a response, just turned back to face the windows, dismissing Margaret the way she'd been dismissed countless times in the past 2 years. The woman scurried away, and Becky felt something shift inside her. Not satisfaction exactly, but a small reclamation of dignity, of the right to name what had been done to her and hold people accountable for their choices. The car arrived. A simple sedan with an older driver who looked at her champagne-soaked dress without judgment or curiosity. Becky gave him the Riverside Drive address and settled into the back seat, watching the hotel recede through the rear window. She thought about Dennis, about what remained of his life after tonight. Part of her, the part that had loved him once or thought she did, felt a twinge of sympathy. But it was small and distant, overpowered by the memory of standing in that ballroom, pregnant and humiliated, while he smiled and the world watched. The apartment Ji-hoon had arranged was in a quiet building far from the elite neighborhoods where Dennis had insisted they live. The lobby was clean but modest, with real plants instead of expensive floral arrangements, with a security guard who nodded kindly instead of assessing her worth. The fourth-floor unit was exactly as promised, furnished simply but comfortably, with a bedroom that had already been set up as a nursery. Someone had hung blackout curtains and assembled a crib, had stocked the drawers with baby clothes in neutral colors, had placed prenatal vitamins and pregnancy books on the nightstand. Becky walked through the space slowly, running her fingers along the furniture, opening drawers and closets. Everything she needed was here, from toiletries to maternity clothes in her size to a fully stocked kitchen. It was comprehensive and impersonal, the work of someone who'd tasked assistants with creating a safe space without injecting his own presence into it. No personal touches, no messages hidden in drawers, nothing that would make her feel obligated or watched or possessed. Just resources and space and the freedom to decide what came next. She found her way to the nursery and stood in the doorway, one hand on her belly, looking at the crib that would soon hold her child. A boy, the ultrasound had revealed, though she hadn't told Dennis. He'd wanted a girl, had already picked out a name that sounded more like a business acquisition than a person. Her son would need a different name, one that represented hope instead of ownership, one that reminded him he was loved for who he was rather than what he could become. Her phone buzzed with notifications, texts from acquaintances asking if she was okay, probably more curious than concerned. Emails from Dennis's lawyer attempting to establish contact. A voicemail from Dennis himself, drunk and rambling and alternating between apologies and accusations. She deleted them all without reading or listening completely. That life was over. Those people had shown her exactly who they were when it mattered, and she believed them. The only message she kept was the one from the unknown number, the one that had given her this apartment and this chance. She read it one more time, then typed out a response she'd been composing in her head during the entire drive. Thank you. For everything. For tonight. For this. For respecting my choice 5 years ago even though it hurt. For not making me choose again now. For showing me the difference between control and protection. I understand now what I didn't understand then. You deserve to know it's a boy. He's healthy. And he'll grow up knowing that real strength means protecting people without demanding they belong to you. She hesitated before adding the final line. You were the dangerous man I ran from, but Dennis was the dangerous man I should have run from. I'm sorry it took me so long to learn the difference. The message sent, and she waited but no response came. She hadn't really expected one. Ji-hoon had said what he needed to say through his actions tonight, had demonstrated the difference between a man who controlled through fear and a man who protected through power. He'd walked away because staying would have put her in exactly the position he'd freed her from. Beholden, obligated, trapped by gratitude into choices that weren't really choices at all. Becky changed out of her ruined dress and into comfortable clothes someone had left in the bedroom closet, then made herself tea in the small kitchen. She stood by the window looking out at the city lights, drinking chamomile and feeling her son move inside her. And for the first time in 2 years, she felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Peace. Not happiness, not yet. That would take time to rebuild. But peace, the quiet certainty that she was finally safe in a way that didn't require making herself smaller. Her phone buzzed one final time. A news alert about Dennis Copeland, CEO removed amid federal investigation, assets frozen, business empire in freefall. The article was already trending, the comments full of people who'd never met Dennis but felt entitled to opinions about his downfall. Becky closed the notification without reading further. His consequences were his own, earned through choices he'd made freely, through cruelties he'd inflicted deliberately. She wasn't responsible for his redemption or destruction. She was only responsible for herself and the child she carried, for building a life rooted in dignity rather than fear, for teaching her son that real power meant knowing when to walk away. Ji-hoon had taught her that lesson tonight, not through words but through demonstration. He'd shown her that protection didn't require possession, that caring for someone sometimes meant leaving them free to choose their own path, that the strongest thing you could do was dismantle someone's ability to hurt the people you loved and then walk away without demanding recognition. That was power. Everything else was just cruelty dressed up in expensive suits and empty promises. And Becky Maynard was done with cruelty. She'd survived it twice now, from 2 very different men, and the experience had taught her something precious. She didn't need someone to save her. She needed the space and resources to save herself. And that was exactly what she'd been given. Not a rescue, but a foundation. What she built on it would be entirely her choice.